Today I want to report to you on the most important alliance the United States has ever enjoyed with any nation. The unsigned but very potent bond between England and the United States, which has been under close scrutiny at the Bermuda Conference by Eisenhower and Prime Minister McMillan. This alliance got a rude shock during the crisis over Suez. We don't realize it over here, but the British people burned with resentment at the way we blocked every British attempt to recover the Canal, which they considered the lifeline of their empire. Never before has anti-American bitterness boiled with such passion. So the big question is, can the alliance be rebuilt? In a minute, I'll report the inside story. I suppose there never was a period when the British looked forward to better relations with the United States than at the beginning of the Eisenhower administration. For in Dwight Eisenhower, Prime Minister Churchill figured that he had an old and trusted friend. However, when he finally visited the new president in Washington, he found Ike not too sympathetic with England. Somehow it seemed Ike had changed. Churchill went away dour and unhappy. But it was expected that the new Prime Minister of England, Sir Anthony Eden, would do better. And when Eden came to Washington in January '56, everything was all smiles on the surface. He was given the red carpet treatment, but he left without any real understanding from the United States. One reason for this was that underneath the smiles, Eden had a supreme dislike for John Foster Dulles. He never liked Dulles when Eden was Foreign Minister of England, and he liked him less when he, Eden, was promoted to be Prime Minister, but was forced by Eisenhower to talk to Dulles as if he were still Foreign Minister. Ike didn't seem to recognize that he was now Prime Minister. Ike's new attitude toward the British was a distinct shock. They had considered him one of their best friends. King George VI had entertained him during the war in the informal privacy of Balmoral Castle. He had delivered one of the greatest speeches on American-British friendship at the Guildhall. Thousands of Londoners crowded the streets as he drove in a horse and carriage to receive the highest honor bestowed by the Lord Mayor of London. Thousands cheered as he paid tribute to the lasting friendship of England and the United States, pledged that they would work together forever toward peace. So enthusiastic were the British that the historic Culzean Castle in Scotland was given him by the grateful people of Scotland. Eisenhower had also been a close friend of Field Marshal Montgomery. He considered cooperation between Americans and British so important that he required one British officer to work side by side with every American. Actually, Eisenhower took a lot of criticism from General George Patton and General Omar Bradley because they held up the American drive on Germany in order to let Montgomery and the British catch up with the Americans. Patton complained that if his gasoline had not been cut off by Ike and given to the British, he would have been inside Germany in '44 instead of '45, thus saving a good many American lives. But for the sake of British-American harmony and to appease British public opinion, Eisenhower stopped Patton just at the border of Germany to wait for the British to catch up. So the British came to consider Eisenhower their best friend. And after he became president, they wondered what had happened to that friend. Well, here is what was happening. Eisenhower was very sensitive to criticism, and some of the criticism of his old army friends that he had favored the British began to get under his skin. More recently, there's been a book by Britain's wartime Chief of Staff, Field Marshal Alan Brooke, in which he described Ike as lacking in tactical skill. What he lacked in military ability, said Brooke, he made up for by the charm of his personality. Long before this, however, the president had begun to feel that he had been taken in by the British. He began to suspect that the beautiful and glamorous British whack, Kay Summersby, who was his secretary and constant companion during the war, had been deliberately planted on him by the British. Later, Miss Summersby wrote a book about the intimate dinners and bridge parties she arranged for Ike during the war, and the president began to suspect that perhaps all this feminine attention had been set up to make sure that he saw life through British eyes when important decisions were being made. So Eisenhower, as president, became different from Eisenhower, the commanding general. The more he thought he might have been pro-British during the war, the more he leaned over backward not to be pro-British as President of the United States. That is the basic reason why Churchill and Eden found a different Eisenhower. There was also one factor in the Suez crisis. For when the war was precipitated right in the middle of his election campaign, Eisenhower took it as a personal attack. He'd been campaigning on a platform for peace, and the British, French, and Israelis upset that platform by precipitating war. As a result, the president was simply livid. He even suspected that the British had instigated the attack in order to upset his pledge of peace and defeat him for re-election. Actually, the British and French had advised the Israelis not to attack during the American election campaign. For weeks, the British had been concentrating troops, stores, munitions of war at Cyprus, ready for later attack. The cream of the British fleet, once the most powerful in the world, was lying off Cyprus and the Egyptian coast. Now, there was a day when Egypt would have run for cover at the mere receipt of a diplomatic note from the British embassy. But times had changed. This time, the British were being super cautious. Israeli intelligence estimated that Egyptian resistance would last 1 hour. The French estimated it would last 1 day. The British figured it would last much longer. So they began a methodical, painstaking bombing of Egyptian airfields for 6 days. 6 agonizing days. The British bombed. The French wanted to send in a paratroop battalion at once to capture Colonel Nasser, the man they figured was the heart of all their trouble, but the British said no. They figured paratroopers would be annihilated. The French chafed at the British delay, so did London. Finally, Anthony Head, British War Minister, flew to Cyprus to urge the British commander, General Keightley, the importance of speed, but Keightley could not be speeded. Thus the British became the laughing stock of the world. It was the most humiliating military incident in the history of a proud empire. In England, the United States is identified with that humiliation. For as the small landing craft were leaving the British cruiser just off Alexandria, 2 American destroyers dashed in among the landing boats, and it looked as if the United States was trying to disconcert the British and spoil the attack. Actually, the destroyers were only there to evacuate American citizens, but the British public didn't know this, and resentment against the United States became more bitter than ever. Now the small, fast-moving Israeli army had captured more than 60,000 Egyptian prisoners in the entire Sinai Peninsula in just 4 days. The British and French, considered among the world's greatest powers, however, were not able to take 1/3 of the Suez Canal in twice that time. The British took prisoners one at a time, used up precious days trying to fire at snipers hidden in the houses of Suez instead of bypassing them. If they'd been quick, incisive, brilliant, there probably would have been no complaint from Eisenhower. A military man admires success, scorns failure. Furthermore, a long drawn-out military stalemate was likely to tempt intervention from Soviet Russia. Intervention and World War III. So during this muddling military operation, right at the peak of England's humiliation, Sir Anthony Eden received a phone call from Eisenhower. It was on the evening of November 5, 1 night before the election. All the pent-up irritation of a man irked at the war which had been injected into his election campaign, all the scorn which a military man has for military failure welled up in the President's voice as he told the Prime Minister to get his troops out of Suez. It was reported afterward that he had used barrack room language. He did. He talked to the Prime Minister of England as if he were a Marine Corps sergeant dressing down recruits at Paris Island. Prime Minister Eden obeyed. He called Premier Mollet in Paris and told him Britain was announcing a ceasefire. At the conclusion of the cabinet meeting that followed, Eden collapsed. The once proud Prime Minister of a once proud nation was a broken man. President Eisenhower refused to see Sir Anthony after that. Eden came all the way to Jamaica in the British West Indies, just a few hours' flight from Washington. He was sick and tired. He'd aged a lifetime in a few months. But in a last attempt to restore himself in the Anglo-American alliance, he asked to come and see the President. The President, the old wartime friend of England, refused. It meant the resignation of Anthony Eden. I'll have some predictions in just a minute. The new Prime Minister of England was originally supposed to be Rab Butler, Lord of the Privy Seal. But at the last minute, Harold McMillan was picked because he had once been attached to Ike's staff in North Africa. And British conservatives consider friendship with the President all important. The United States, of course, is vitally important to England, but it also happens that England is vital to the United States. The number one strategy of this country in any war between Russia, is use of England as a giant stationary airplane carrier. Some Americans, even high up in the State Department and the White House, however, seem to have forgotten this. So here are my predictions. The Bermuda Conference, despite flowery communiques, will not materially patch up our strained relations with England. As long as the Conservative Party remains in power, however, I predict the British will go along with us on major policy. There will be grousing and resentment, but England will cooperate. Many Britishers, however, are becoming increasingly isolationist. More and more people are arguing that England should not be a bombing base and a bombing target during a war between the United States and Russia. They want to stay out. Chief spokesman of this group is an Iron Bevan, the left-wing leader of the Labour Party. So here is another prediction. At the next election, the British Labour Party, I predict, will win. I further predict that the Foreign Secretary of England will then become an Iron Bevan, who will go to Russia and patch up a new working agreement with Moscow, whereby England will become neutral if Anglo-American relations continue to drift as they are today. I'll have a final word in just a minute. Next week, in view of the Senate investigation of labor, I'll interview one of the most important labor leaders in the world.